So, at this point, I'd like to introduce Kalima Rose. As I mentioned very briefly, she's the Senior Director for Infrastructure Equity at PolicyLink. She leads their work, their capacity building work for the Sustainable Communities Learning Network that serves you all, and has held that role for, I guess, going on 3 years now. Kalima and her organization were key in developing the Federal Partnership for Sustainable Communities and activating how it would serve communities. And before that, she has an extensive resume, including a role near and dear to my heart as a Louisianian, which was helping in significant ways investing herself and her organization in post-Katrina, post-Rita recovery in Louisiana. So please help me welcome Kalima Rose to describe ongoing efforts to make sure that equity is included in implementation of our work. Kalima?
Good afternoon. How's everyone doing out there today? So I am PolicyLink. I hope we've gotten to work with all of you. I don't know everyone in the room, but I know many of you. How many of you feel like your Sustainable Communities Planning grants helped you engage low-income communities and communities of color and think about the issues of economic futures and making places better for those communities? Okay, a handful of you. When these grants came out, and HUD had played a long time role in thinking about those issues, it was a pretty new concept for the Department of Transportation and the Environmental Protection Agency to both work in an interagency partnership and think about really specific ways to target those populations. And in 2010, when the grant started, was just at the time that the new census was coming out. And so the context in which people were thinking about sustainability and resilience in their regions was a context in which job structures were radically changing in America. And so you can see a huge growth in low-wage jobs in the last decade, a little tiny blip in middle-wage jobs, and then a pretty big increase in high-wage jobs. And so thinking about the infrastructure that was happening in regions and land use planning was in this context of pretty radically changing jobs. And then people were looking back just from the last decade of what were the changing demographics in their region. And so this was really the first time that the nation began thinking about the fact that we were becoming a majority people of color nation. And so I'm just going to do this little time-lapse map for you to show you where we have been coming from. The counties that are red on this map already have a majority of people of color in them, and the changing shades of orange and yellow catch up to are changing in that direction. So this was what 2000 looked like. This is 2010, 2020, this is where we're headed, 2030, and 2040. And so you can see that as the nation becomes a majority people of color, and we're thinking about sustainability in our region, these are communities that we need to make sure are prospering. And you can see the really vast change between elderly seniors in America and young population. And so if you look at that map on the right, where young people are today, young children of color, they really are what the 2040 map looks like. So we already have this in our school systems and in our thinking about economic futures. And when we look at the different populations, the right two bars are educational attainment of the white population, where over 50 and 60% have higher bachelor's degrees or higher. And you can see in the middle is Latino, where 9% of the population has higher education, and going left to African Americans. So if we're thinking about our economic futures in terms of educational attainment and where that will be, we also have investment and work to do to make sure that that future is successful. So the capacity building work that PolicyLink has been doing has been very focused on helping regions and challenge grantees think about those futures and plan for them in ways that are very inclusive of those communities. And so maybe 4 months ago, we did a survey to which about a third of the grantees answered on how the structures of equity in the Sustainable Communities grants, how you felt like you had been able to move forward in progress. So I'm just going to spend about 8 minutes telling you what we learned from those surveys. And at the end of this, I'm going to hand out to you a little draft working document we have about what we learned and where we think we should be headed in this regard. And there's contact information at the bottom of it. We would love to have those of you who didn't answer, or those of you who are members of your Sustainable Communities grants, give us more feedback on what you think is needed. So what we learned from the initiative, and when we say equity, we mean that all the residents of a municipality or a region have access to the opportunities of the region, so that transportation systems connect them, that the workforce development, planning, and access are connected with growth sectors of the economy where there are good middle-skilled jobs, that affordable housing is located in communities with access to good services and good schools. And so what we learned from the way the Sustainable Communities Initiative was structured was that by requiring that 10% of your budgets had to go to community engagement, that budgeting of working with communities that don't typically participate in planning processes was critical, and everyone said they did a lot more of it than they usually do, and that they learned new methods. They said that meaningful engagement of those communities required really consistent and reciprocal capacity building, so that planners had to learn a lot about how to do that, and community had to learn a lot about the technical aspects of planning for their economic and transportation futures, et cetera. That the real success, while engagement was important, the real success is achieving equity outcomes by seeing policy change, new investments going to those communities, and quality of life changes for those communities. So engagement is critical, but not the end game. That a really important thing, but that by providing data disaggregated by race, ethnicity, and income by HUD to all the grantees and asking them to use that for planning and seeing where past investments had gone in their region really created the ability for new discussions to be had, and for thinking about, when talking about poverty, not just having an affordable housing conversation, but really having a new economy conversation and thinking about the pathways for those communities and what other infrastructure investments should go there. That incredible progress was made because of the governance structures that happened, that community-based organizations were sitting at the tables with regional planning organizations or with cities. That local groups who typically don't work at the regional level had unprecedented opportunities to sit at those tables and to work up through regional structures, state structures, and the federal government, and to meet their counterparts across the region who work on similar issues of addressing poverty and improving opportunity, and that their capacity really got built through it. And that a much broader set of stakeholders is now focused on sustainable economic futures for those changing demographic communities. And so we think that is a lot of progress. And congratulations to all of you for your work contributing to that. But that really is what's in a plan. And now, what do those lessons teach us in thinking about moving forward for implementation? And so I think the very biggest number one lesson, and Chris, I handed you those handouts, right? Maybe you could just pass them around to the table. Is I think the biggest, most important thing, and we see movement in this regard, is getting more resources to be targeted to implementation that have equity criteria attached to them. So what does that mean practically? Many people have talked about rewriting general plans and land use plans, et cetera. So if that's going to happen, if new zoning is going to happen around transit, et cetera, that you would really be looking in those general plans to be making sure that those communities of high poverty were targeted with new infrastructure resources, that they were part of capital improvement plans, regional transportation plans, et cetera, and that high opportunity communities were zoned to make sure that affordability was going in there. But it also means creating new criteria for existing funding streams. So if there are education bonds happening in your state, you would get written criteria that high poverty neighborhoods would have capital improvement money going to schools in their communities. It would mean that transportation investment plans made sure that some set aside was set for high poverty communities. So in California, we have a state strategic growth fund, which are kind of like federal sustainable community grants. And this is an example of a criteria that you would do. The state set aside 25% of those funds for high poverty communities. And then for the other 75%, they created competitive scoring. And that scoring, if you are going to address the issues of high poverty communities, you get more competitive points. So it just, in the same way that this federal initiative helped focus all of you on those issues, by doing the same thing with funding sources in your state and your region and your locality, you can make similar progress. The second one is to institutionalize policies that promote meaningful community engagement. And so just like the Sustainable Communities Consortia laid out ways for you to do that within this grant context, you can then do the same thing through ordinances, resolutions, executive orders of the agencies that you represent, to require community engagement in various planning processes, to target resources to those communities, et cetera. So for each of the seats that you sit in and are representing here today, think about how you can institutionalize those kinds of practices in the agencies that you either represent or that you do advocacy with. This was mentioned in the last talk, that the third really important thing is making sure you have ongoing advocacy capacity. So the organizations that you ask to participate in your planning process, make sure that they continue to come to every decision-making table as these implementation resources are decided over the next decade, because it will take a decade for you to implement your plans. Just like HUD gave you data to assess where high poverty, where racially concentrated poverty, where lack of infrastructure investments were happening, you should continue to track equity data and to use that data to inform the allocation of resources in whichever resource pools you have authority over. And then creating the ongoing infrastructure to implement equity. So most of the bodies that received these planning grants have some sort of appointed or elected board. And some of you used those boards to be the guiding shepherd of these resources, and others of you created multi-stakeholder consortia that guided this money. And I think everybody had the experience of having multi-stakeholder consortia play some role. And so the question now is, how do you keep that cross-sector consortia going forward so that you can monitor the implementation of the vision that you have done? And people are doing this in really diverse ways, but keeping those equity stakeholders in that fold is really important. So some of the ongoing infrastructure ways that people are going, they're going to their MPOs and saying, how can we have our representative appointed board be more in alignment with the demographic changes in our state so that those communities' interests are being represented. If it is a city council or a city agency that got the grant, they're thinking in the same way of what are the kinds of committees or subcommittees that can carry this goal. Or if it's an association of governments, how can they create ongoing infrastructure, and I see I have 1 minute, I'm about to wrap. How can they create ongoing infrastructure? And then I think the final point is how can you codify the best equity approaches into policy through regional and local legislation and administrative guidance. And so, like I gave the examples of how infrastructure pots of money are used or how states can target money, you can do that with every source. So I want to say that we are available to you throughout your next 2 years of implementation to help advance these equity goals. There is a webinar coming up on January 22nd, and there are 4 sessions in this next 2 days that are really focused on these things. And if you could give us feedback on this handout, if either you've found other important ways of structuring equity, or you think that we haven't characterized well the things that you are doing, we would love to have that feedback. And so good luck in planning for your economic futures and thinking about the equity roles that you can play as civic leaders in your own community. Thank you.